We're going to talk briefly about the medical biochemistry. So an overview of what happens to the food that you eat. So the primary roles of the digestive system in the human body is to break down food into the smaller nutrient parts that are small enough to be absorbed by our body, and then eventually that all that it can be taken out of that is absorbed and the rest is eliminated. So digestion is the breakdown of those large food molecules into nutrients that the body can use, and the absorption is the uptake of that into our cells and into our bloodstream. The gastrointestinal tract is the organ that will actually do the digestion and the absorption. So this is the digestive tract. Basically, it goes from your mouth to your anus, through your stomach and small intestine, and we'll just kind of follow that food, starting with your mouth. Your oral cavity is where all of your digestion starts. You break down your food through mechanical digestion with your teeth and your tongue and your mouth, and you prepare that food. You break it down to smaller bits so that you can swallow it, and your tongue helps your food get directed into your pharynx and ability to bring this down into your the rest of your digestive tract. Your taste buds are what specialize in recognizing some of the molecules that are in the food that we're eating. And we have 5 basic taste senses: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami. And umami, that's kind of, it's described as a brothy or meaty taste. So these receptors are in your tongue. They identify these and send signals up to your brain that tell you what it is that your food tastes like. But actually, a lot of the taste actually comes from your sense of smell. So there's an alimentary canal that connects the esophagus. So when you're swallowing your food and you're chewing it, some of those food particles or those small bits of organic compounds, right? Those aromatic compounds or those different types of esters, aldehydes, ketones, all sorts of those things get up here into the olfactory bulb and bind to receptors up here, and then these actually also signal to your brain what it is that you're eating. Once you've swallowed your food, then peristalsis occurs, and waves of muscle contraction pushes that food down into your stomach. So this is an involuntary response to swallowing. You don't have to think about getting that food down to your stomach. That just happens, and then we get into the stomach part, different parts of the stomach where your food is digested. The pH is very low. We start to denature some of those proteins. We'll talk about that a little more in detail later. But the gastric juices are released, the pH is reduced. Stomach secretions, including mucus, hydrochloric acid, intrinsic factor, which helps take up vitamin B12, and other digestive enzymes are released in the stomach. The stomach actually has a lot of specialized cells. You can kind of see here is a cross section of you have the connective, the muscle layer, different muscle layer, multiple muscle layers to help push and contract and kind of mix up that food, some blood vessels, and then we have these gastric glands. We're going to zoom in on the gastric glands there. And you can see that there are a lot of different, these are all just showing you the different types of cell that are part of your stomach. And we have the gastric juice is released from these cells, includes mucus to help protect the cells from the digestive enzymes that is being released in the hydrochloric acid. Intrinsic factor I mentioned before that helps take up B12 vitamin, other digestive enzymes as well. So the mucus cells help to secrete this mucus population. Those are on the neck in the top end, and that's just again to help push a mucus layer over the cells, and it helps to protect them from the acids and things, then the digestive enzymes that are being released. Parietal cells are next in line here, and it's going to be releasing the hydrochloric acid, intrinsic factor that then helps with the function of the stomach, and the chief cells down here as well. Those are secreting some of the chemically inactive digestive enzymes. They're inactive until they actually get up into here where we have the hydrochloric acid content, and those acid levels are higher concentration, and then we can actually activate some of those digestive enzymes. We'll talk more about those a little later when we get into the specific macromolecules that we digest. There are in the stomach also G cells that secrete gastrin, and those are more at the bottom here that I was showing you, kind of more at the end. Hormone that it helps to stimulate stomach motility and the other gastric gland secretion. And then chyme is a semi-liquid that forms when food mixes with the gastric juices, and that's all occurring in the lower stomach. In the presence of food, it stimulates peristalsis via the gastrin. Some proteins and fat are broken down. Few substances are absorbed in the stomach. Not much is absorbed there. Most of it's just getting broken down at this point until it's ready to go into released by the pyloric sphincter into the small intestine. Some of the common digestive tract disorders are some of the peptic ulcers, and it was actually found that this was a infection by H. pylori. So there's an interesting article if you want to go and look at this YouTube link to learn more about this. Dr. Barry Marshall, it's a really interesting story about how he actually ingested. He believed that peptic ulcers were caused by bacteria. No one believed him forever. And he actually gave himself ulcers by drinking some of, a vial of this H. pylori bacterium, and gave himself peptic ulcers. And then he cured himself with an antibiotic that killed these bacteria and recovered from that. But it was a pretty dramatic and interesting story about that process. So once we get out of the stomach and into the duodenum of the small intestines, it follows through the duodenum to the jejunum, the ileum, and into the lower large intestine. So there are all these different sections of our intestines, and it controls essentially the digestion. This is where most of our nutrients are actually absorbed in our small intestines. So again, and it's a major site of chemical and mechanical digestion as well. Some of that's happening in the stomach. That's really just preparing everything to happen. But a lot of enzyme activity is happening in the small intestine. And there's segmentation that happens. So these little bits kind of get concentrated. And we're gonna in a second here, I'm gonna talk about some of the cells that line the intestine. But first I wanted to talk about some of the accessory organs of the digestive system. With the liver, we have the gallbladder, and the bile ducts, and the pancreas. And so these are important accessories because they're accessories because the chyme that digesting food doesn't pass through them, but they play a major role in the digestion. And the liver is important for storing and processing nutrients. It also synthesizes cholesterol, and it makes bile, and that bile is a fluid that's produced by the liver, stored in the gallbladder. And we're going to talk about that in a minute when we start talking about the digestion and the uptake of lipids. And the gallbladder here is just close to underneath the liver, and it's basically going to store and concentrate that bile that the liver is actually synthesizing. Finally, the pancreas produces a lot of enzymes and bicarbonate ions. So bicarbonate is going to reduce the pH of what's coming out of the stomach, and enzymes that can be released into the small intestine. So, and we'll talk about those processes in a little bit, but just kind of an outline of some of the different types of enzymes here, amylase, lipase, chymotrypsin, and we'll talk about these in a little more detail, but then where they release from the pancreas, the small intestine, and we can break down starches and fats and proteins, and more proteins, DNA, RNA, so lots of different components that are broken down in the intestine. So this is a major area of macromolecule breakdown. And it's also a place where a lot of stuff is going to be absorbed. So we're going to look at these cells that line and kind of look at these like little fingers that are in the small intestine with all of these little cells. And these cells, if you zoom in on those, they also have these. So there are villi, these bigger finger regions, but each of these cells has the little finger regions as well. And this is where the nutrients can get caught in these little fingers here and these little branches, and then that's where they're absorbed into the cell. They're processed in the cell, and then they can be transported to the capillary or the bloodstream in the on the basal side of the cell. So again, these enterocytes help remove the nutrients from the chyme and then enable it to enter the bloodstream or the lymph vessels. And here's just a bigger picture of the same thing. And again, these are called microvilli or the brush border. They contain enzymes that help to digest proteins and carbohydrates. There are these tiny hair-like projections that are really important for digestion. And a lot of different ways that these nutrients get into these enterocytes. Simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion, active transport, osmosis, endocytosis. So these tissues are able to bring in those different types of molecules through all of these different mechanisms. Once a lot of the food is actually absorbed in the small intestine, and there's really not that much that's getting absorbed now in the large intestine. Some water, a few minerals, but most of it should have already gotten out. And if it didn't, it's just going to go on through the rest of our system. So these are also, after moving through that ileocecal sphincter, unabsorbed water, undigested remains of chyme enter into the cecum, and then they are pushed through the large intestine and exit out the anal canal. So one of the other things that that's interesting is a lot of times you may have heard that the appendix is kind of a non-functional organ. Well, it actually turns out it may have an important role in populating the gut with the proper bacteria. So there's gut flora, multiplies in this area, and it can be released into the large intestine. So thought to actually recently to have more important function in the having proper gut bacteria. And actually, if you look at the human body, a healthy intestine contains a lot of microflora. So if you look at, if you're just looking at in the stomach, very high pH, but there are still 25 different species of bacteria that can be found in the stomach, some good, some bad. So here's a listed Heliobacter pylori, which actually are not good, obviously, as I just spoke about. 600 plus in the lungs, 1,000 on the skin, 60 species in the urogenital tract, but 500 to 1,000 species within our stomach and our intestines, or sorry, more within our intestines. So a lot of these can be important have important beneficial effects for the human host. And many are able to help metabolize food, different types of foods that we can't, synthesize certain types of fat, produces various vitamins that we cannot produce. So they can be very important and very helpful for our bodies. And here are just some possible benefits to probiotics for preventing diarrhea, irritable bowel syndrome, changing blood fat levels, protection against ulcers if we have good bacteria in there that protect it against the H. pylori, for example, helping us with lactose intolerance or constipation. So all of these different things that can be beneficial if we have the proper gut flora. So kind of points out to the, possibly the appendix is not a useful organ. It can actually have some type of useful function. So now we're going to start the next section is going to be talking about what's in our food, and we'll be looking more at the biochemical nature of the breakdown of the food.